Chapter 15 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The first battle, fought and finished, Martin said to the looking-glass 10 days later. But there will be a second battle and a third battle, and battles to the end of time, unless— He had not finished the sentence, but looked about the mean little room and let his eyes dwell sadly upon a heap of returned manuscripts, still in their long envelopes, which lay in a corner on the floor. He had no stamps with which to continue them on their travels, and for a week they had been piling up. More of them would come in on the morrow, and on the next day, and the next, till they were all in. And he would be unable to start them out again. He was a month's rent behind on the typewriter, which he could not pay, having barely enough for the week's board, which was due, and for the employment office fees. He sat down and regarded the table thoughtfully. There were ink stains upon it, and he suddenly discovered that he was fond of it. "Dear old table," he said, "I've spent some happy hours with you, and you've been a pretty good friend when all is said and done. You never turned me down, never passed me out a reward of unmerit rejection slip, never complained about working overtime." He dropped his arms upon the table and buried his face in them. His throat was aching, and he wanted to cry. It reminded him of his first fight, when he was 6 years old, when he punched away with the tears running down his cheeks, while the other boy, 2 years older, had beaten and pounded him into exhaustion. He saw the ring of boys, howling like barbarians, as he went down at last, writhing in the throes of nausea, the blood streaming from his nose and the tears from his bruised eyes. "Poor little shaver," he murmured, "and you're just as badly licked now. You're beaten to a pulp. You're down and out." But the vision of that first fight still lingered under his eyelids, and as he watched, he saw it dissolve and reshape into the series of fights which had followed. 6 months later, Cheeseface, that was the boy, had whipped him again, but he had blacked Cheeseface's eye that time. That was going some. He saw them all, fight after fight, himself always whipped, and Cheeseface exulting over him. But he had never run away. He felt strengthened by the memory of that. He had always stayed and taken his medicine. Cheeseface had been a little fiend at fighting, and had never once shown mercy to him. But he had stayed. He had stayed with it. Next, he saw a narrow alley, between ramshackle frame buildings. The end of the alley was blocked by a one-story brick building, out of which issued the rhythmic thunder of the presses, running off the first edition of the Enquirer. He was 11, and Cheeseface was 13, and they both carried the Enquirer. That was why they were there, waiting for their papers. And, of course, Cheeseface had picked on him again, and there was another fight that was indeterminate, because at 3:45 the door of the press room was thrown open, and the gang of boys crowded in to fold their papers. "I'll lick you tomorrow," he heard Cheeseface promise, and he heard his own voice, piping and trembling with unshed tears, agreeing to be there on the morrow. And he had come there the next day, hurrying from school to be there first, and beating Cheeseface by 2 minutes. The other boys said he was all right, and gave him advice, pointing out his faults as a scrapper, and promising him victory if he carried out their instructions. The same boys gave Cheeseface advice, too, how they had enjoyed the fight. He paused in his recollections long enough to envy them the spectacle he and Cheeseface had put up. Then the fight was on, and it went on without rounds for 30 minutes, until the press-room door was opened. He watched the youthful apparition of himself, day after day, hurrying from school to the Enquirer alley. He could not walk very fast. He was stiff and lame from the incessant fighting. His forearms were black and blue from wrist to elbow, what of the countless blows he had warded off, and here and there the tortured flesh was beginning to fester. His head and arms and shoulders ached. The small of his back ached. He ached all over. and his brain was heavy and dazed. He did not play at school, nor did he study. Even to sit still all day at his desk, as he did, was a torment. It seemed centuries since he had begun the round of daily fights, and time stretched away into a nightmare and infinite future of daily fights. Why couldn't Cheeseface be licked, he often thought. That would put him, Martin, out of his misery. It never entered his head to cease fighting, to allow Cheeseface to whip him. And so he dragged himself to the Inquirer Alley, sick in body and soul, but learning the long patience to confront the eternal enemy, Cheeseface, who was just as sick as he, and just a bit willing to quit if it were not for the gang of newsboys that looked on and made pride painful and necessary. One afternoon, after 20 minutes of desperate efforts to annihilate each other, according to set rules that did not permit kicking, striking below the belt, nor hitting when one was down, Cheeseface, panting for breath and reeling, offered to call it quits. And Martin, head on arms, thrilled at the picture he caught of himself, at that moment in the afternoon of long ago, when he reeled and panted and choked, with the blood that ran into his mouth and down his throat from his cut lips, when he tottered toward Cheeseface, spitting out a mouthful of blood so that he could speak, crying out that he would never quit, though Cheeseface could give in if he wanted to. And Cheeseface did not give in, and the fight went on. The next day and the next, days without end, witnessed the afternoon fight. When he put up his arms each day to begin, they pained exquisitely, and the first few blows, struck and received, racked his soul. After that, things grew numb, and he fought on blindly, seeing as in a dream, dancing and wavering, the large features and burning, animal-like eyes of Cheeseface. He concentrated upon that face. All else about him was a whirling void. There was nothing else in the world but that face, and he would never know rest, blessed rest, until he had beaten that face into a pulp with his bleeding knuckles, or until the bleeding knuckles that somehow belonged to that face had beaten him into a pulp. And then, one way or the other, he would have rest. But to quit, for him, Martin, to quit, that was impossible. Came the day when he dragged himself into the Inquirer Alley, and there was no Cheeseface. Nor did Cheeseface come. The boys congratulated him, and told him that he had licked Cheeseface. But Martin was not satisfied. He had not licked Cheeseface, nor had Cheeseface licked him. The problem had not been solved. It was not until afterward that they learned that Cheeseface's father had died suddenly that very day. Martin skipped on through the years to the night in the nigger heaven at the auditorium. He was 17 and just back from sea. A row started. Somebody was bullying somebody, and Martin interfered, to be confronted by Cheeseface's blazing eyes. "I'll fix you after the show," his ancient enemy hissed. Martin nodded. The nigger heaven bouncer was making his way toward the disturbance. "I'll meet you outside, after the last act," Martin whispered, the while his face showed undivided interest in the buck and wing dancing on the stage. The bouncer glared and went away. "Got a gang?" he asked Cheeseface at the end of the act. "Sure." "Then I got to get one," Martin announced. Between the acts, he mustered his following. 3 fellows he knew from the nail works, a railroad fireman, and half a dozen of the Boo gang, along with as many more from the dread 18 and Market gang. When the theater let out, the 2 gangs strung along inconspicuously on opposite sides of the street. When they came to a quiet corner, they united and held a council of war. 8th Street Bridge is the place, said a red-headed fellow belonging to Cheeseface's gang. "You can fight in the middle, under the electric light, and whichever way the bulls come in, we can sneak the other way." "That's agreeable to me," Martin said, after consulting with the leaders of his own gang. The 8th Street Bridge, crossing an arm of San Antonio estuary, was the length of 3 city blocks. In the middle of the bridge, and at each end, were electric lights. No policeman could pass those end lights unseen. It was the safe place for the battle that revived itself under Martin's eyelids. He saw the 2 gangs, aggressive and sullen, rigidly keeping apart from each other and backing their respective champions. And he saw himself and Cheeseface stripping. A short distance away lookouts were set, their task being to watch the lighted ends of the bridge. A member of the Boo Gang held Martin's coat and shirt and cap, ready to race with them into safety in case the police interfered. Martin watched himself go into the center, facing Cheeseface, and he heard himself say, as he held up his hand warningly, "They ain't no handshaking in this, understand? They ain't nothing but scrap. No throwing up the sponge. This is a grudge fight, and it's to the finish, understand? Somebody's going to get licked." Cheeseface wanted to demur. Martin could see that. But Cheeseface's old perilous pride was touched before the 2 gangs. "Aw, come on," he replied. "What's the good of chewing the rag about? I'm with you to the finish." Then they fell upon each other like young bulls, in all the glory of youth, with naked fists, with hatred, with desire to hurt, to maim, to destroy. All the painful 1,000 years' gains of man in his upward climb through creation were lost. Only the electric light remained, a milestone on the path of the great human adventure. Martin and Cheeseface were 2 savages of the Stone Age, of the squatting place and the tree refuge. They sank lower and lower into the muddy abyss, back into the dregs of the raw beginnings of life, striving blindly and chemically, as atoms strive, as the stardust of the heavens strives, colliding, recoiling, and colliding again and eternally again. "God, we are animals, brute beasts," Martin muttered aloud, as he watched the progress of the fight. It was to him, with his splendid power of vision, like gazing into a kinetoscope. He was both onlooker and participant. His long months of culture and refinement shuddered at the sight. Then the present was blotted out of his consciousness, and the ghosts of the past possessed him, and he was Martin Eden, just returned from sea, and fighting Cheeseface on the 8th Street Bridge. He suffered and toiled and sweated and bled, and exulted when his naked knuckles smashed home. They were twin whirlwinds of hatred, revolving about each other monstrously. The time passed, and the 2 hostile gangs became very quiet. They had never witnessed such intensity of ferocity, and they were awed by it. The 2 fighters were greater brutes than they. The first splendid velvet edge of youth and condition wore off, and they fought more cautiously and deliberately. There had been no advantage gained either way. "It's anybody's fight," Martin heard someone saying. Then he followed up a feint right and left, was fiercely countered, and felt his cheek laid open to the bone. No bare knuckle had done that. He heard mutters of amazement at the ghastly damage wrought, and was drenched with his own blood. But he gave no sign. He became immensely wary, for he was wise with knowledge of the low cunning and foul vileness of his kind. He watched and waited until he feigned a wild rush, which he stopped midway, for he had seen the glint of metal. "Hold up your hand," he screamed. "Them's brass knuckles, and you hit me with 'em." Both gangs surged forward, growling and snarling. In a second there would be a free-for-all fight, and he would be robbed of his vengeance. He was beside himself. "You guys keep out," he screamed hoarsely. "Understand? Say, do you understand?" They shrank away from him. They were brutes, but he was the arch-brute, a thing of terror that towered over them and dominated them. "This is my scrap, and they ain't going to be no buttin' in. Gimme them knuckles." Cheeseface, sobered and a bit frightened, surrendered the foul weapon. "You passed him to him, you redhead sneaking in behind the push there." Martin went on, as he tossed the knuckles into the water. "I seen you, and I was wondering what you was up to. If you try anything like that again, I'll beat you to death, understand?" They fought on, through exhaustion and beyond, to exhaustion immeasurable and inconceivable, until the crowd of brutes, its bloodlust sated, terrified by what it saw, begged them impartially to cease. And Cheeseface, ready to drop and die, or to stay on his legs and die, a grisly monster, out of whose features all likeness to Cheeseface had been beaten, wavered and hesitated. But Martin sprang in and smashed him again and again. Next, after a seeming century or so, with Cheeseface weakening fast, in a mix-up of blows, there was a loud snap, and Martin's right arm dropped to his side. It was a broken bone. Everybody heard it and knew, and Cheeseface knew, rushing like a tiger in the other's extremity, and raining blow on blow. Martin's gang surged forward to interfere. Dazed by the rapid succession of blows, Martin warned them back with vile and earnest curses, sobbed out and groaned, in ultimate desolation and despair. He punched on, with his left hand only, and as he punched, doggedly, only half conscious, as from a remote distance he heard murmurs of fear in the gangs, and one said, with shaking voice, "This ain't scrap, fellows. It's murder, and we ought to stop it." But no one stopped it, and he was glad, punching on wearily and endlessly with his one arm, battering away at a bloody something before him that was not a face but a horror, an oscillating, hideous, gibbering, nameless thing that persisted before his wavering vision and would not go away. And he punched on and on, slower and slower, as the last shreds of vitality oozed from him, through centuries and eons and enormous lapses of time, until, in a dim way, he became aware that the nameless thing was sinking, slowly sinking down, to the rough board planking of the bridge. And the next moment he was standing over it, staggering and swaying on shaky legs, clutching at the air for support, and saying in a voice he did not recognize, "Do you want any more? Say, do you want any more?" He was still saying it over and over, demanding, entreating, threatening, to know if it wanted any more, when he felt the fellows of his gang laying hands on him, patting him on the back, and trying to put his coat on him. And then came a sudden rush of blackness and oblivion. The tin alarm clock on the table ticked on, but Martin Eden, his face buried in his arms, did not hear it. He heard nothing. He did not think. So absolutely had he relived life that he had fainted just as he had fainted years before on the 8th Street Bridge. For a full minute the blackness and the blankness endured. Then, like one from the dead, he sprang upright, eyes flaming, sweat pouring down his face, shouting, "I licked you, Cheeseface. It took me 11 years, but I licked you." His knees were trembling under him. He felt faint, and he staggered back to the bed, sinking down and sitting on the edge of it. He was still in the clutch of the past. He looked about the room, perplexed, alarmed, wondering where he was, until he caught sight of the pile of manuscripts in the corner. Then the wheels of memory slipped ahead through 4 years of time, and he was aware of the present, of the books he had opened and the universe he had won from their pages, of his dreams and ambitions, and of his love for a pale wraith of a girl, sensitive and sheltered and ethereal, who would die of horror did she witness but one moment of what he had just lived through, one moment of all the muck of his life through which he had waded. He arose to his feet and confronted himself in the looking-glass. "And so you rise from the mud, Martin Eden," he said solemnly, "and you cleanse your eyes in a great brightness, and thrust your shoulders among the stars, doing what all life has done, letting the ape and tiger die, and wresting highest heritage from all powers that be." He looked more closely at himself and laughed. "A bit of hysteria and melodrama, eh? he queried. Well, never mind. You licked Cheeseface, and you'll lick the editors if it takes twice 11 years to do it in. You can't stop here. You've got to go on. It's to a finish, you know. End of chapter 15.